The autumn wind swept down from the Rocky Mountains like a cold, invisible hand, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant snow. It whistled through the narrow streets of Cedar Ridge, a small mining town perched precariously on the edge of civilization, where the last vestiges of law met the wild frontier. Dust devils danced between the weathered buildings, and tumbleweeds rolled past the general store like nature's own wanderers. Inside the modest wooden house at the edge of town, Eliza Whitmore sat by the window, her fingers tracing the rough grain of the windowsill. Though her left eye saw nothing but shadows and blur, her right eye caught fragments of the world outside, the flutter of a woman's calico dress, the dark outline of a horse tied to the hitching post, the golden light of late afternoon painting the distant mountains. She listened more than she looked these days, her world having shifted from one of sight to one of sound and touch. The floorboards creaked behind her, and she recognized her mother's hesitant footsteps. Margaret Whitmore had developed a particular way of walking since the accident, as if each step might shatter something precious. "Eliza, dear," her mother began, and Eliza could hear the worry threading through her voice like a persistent ache. "Perhaps you should come away from the window. The draft." "I'm fine, Mother," Eliza replied softly, though they both knew she spoke of more than just the chill air. Her left hand unconsciously moved to her skirts, smoothing them over her left leg, the leg that would never again move with the easy grace it once had. It had been 3 years since the accident, 3 years since that terrible day when the stagecoach had overturned on the mountain pass, crushing her beneath splintered wood and twisted metal. The other passengers had walked away with bruises and frightening memories. Eliza had been pulled from the wreckage with a shattered leg and damage to her left eye that no doctor could repair. She remembered little of those first dark months, only pain and the gradual, crushing realization that her life had irrevocably changed. The young men who had once lined up to dance with her at the harvest social now crossed the street when they saw her coming, their eyes sliding away as if her misfortune might be contagious. "Your father's speaking with Reverend Morrison again," Margaret continued, and Eliza's jaw tightened. She knew what that meant. Another attempt to find someone, anyone, who might be willing to take her off their hands. The thought stung more than she cared to admit. "Let him speak," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the hurt. "The Reverend's matchmaking efforts have been notably unsuccessful thus far." Her mother sighed, a sound heavy with unspoken fears. Thomas Whitmore was a good man, but practical to his core. With his small blacksmith shop barely keeping them fed, and Eliza unable to contribute as other daughters might, helping with washing, working at the mercantile, or teaching at the schoolhouse, she had become what every woman in the frontier feared becoming: a burden. Outside, the sounds of the town continued their familiar rhythm. The ring of her father's hammer on the anvil carried from his shop 2 streets over. Children's laughter echoed from the schoolyard. The saloon piano tinkled its tinny melody, preparing for the evening crowd. Life moved on, as it always did, leaving some behind in its wake. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by earlier," her mother ventured. "She mentioned her nephew from Denver might be visiting next month. A widower, she said, looking to start fresh." Eliza closed her eyes, her good one and the damaged one alike. "Mother, please. We both know what Mrs. Henderson truly meant. A widower desperate enough to consider someone like me." "Don't speak that way about yourself," Margaret protested, but her voice lacked conviction. They both knew the truth of their situation. In a world where a woman's worth was measured by her ability to bear children, keep house, and support her husband's endeavors, what value did a partially blind, lame woman have? The front door banged open, and Thomas Whitmore's heavy boots announced his arrival. Eliza heard him speaking in low tones with her mother in the kitchen, their words indistinct, but their meaning clear. Another day, another failure to find someone willing to shoulder the responsibility of a damaged bride. That evening at dinner, the silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Eliza ate mechanically, her movements practiced and careful. She had learned to navigate her limited vision, to compensate with her other senses. But she could not navigate the disappointment that hung in the air like smoke from the oil lamps. "The Millers are moving west," her father finally said, his voice gruff. "Selling their place. Oregon Territory, they say. Plenty of opportunities there."
"Perhaps we should consider it,"
Margaret suggested carefully.
"A fresh start might—"
"Running won't change anything," Eliza interrupted, setting down her fork with deliberate control.
"I'll still be who I am in Oregon. Still be what I am."
Her father's fist hit the table, making the dishes jump. "You're my daughter," he said fiercely.
"That's what you are, and any man would be lucky. Please, Father, let's not pretend."
Eliza's voice was calm, almost gentle. "I hear what they say at the general store. I know what they whisper at church. Who would take on such a burden? What man would saddle himself with a wife who can barely see, who walks with a permanent limp?" The words hung in the air like accusation, though she hadn't meant them that way. She understood her parents' desperation. In a year, maybe 2, her father's strength would begin to fade. Her mother's arthritis was already making itself known in the cold mornings. What would become of her then? That night, Eliza lay in her narrow bed, listening to the wind howl around the eaves. It spoke of empty spaces and distant places, of freedom she would never know. She had once dreamed of love, the kind she read about in the few novels that made their way to Cedar Ridge, a love that saw past surfaces to the soul beneath. But those were dreams for whole women, complete women, not for her. The moonlight streaming through her window was bright enough that even her damaged eye could perceive its glow. She raised her hand, studying the silhouette of her fingers against the light. Still strong, still capable. If only the rest of the world could see past her infirmities to the strength that remained. In the darkness, she allowed herself a moment of bitter truth. She had heard her father talking with the other men at the saloon last week. She'd been passing by on her way to the general store and caught his words on the wind. "I'd give her away with half my savings if someone would just take her," he'd said, his voice slurred with whiskey and desperation. "Hell, I'd give all of it, just so she'd be taken care of when I'm gone." The words had cut deeper than any knife. Though she understood the fear behind them, her father loved her. She had never doubted that. But love couldn't change the harsh realities of frontier life, where survival often trumped sentiment. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, its lonely cry echoing off the canyon walls. Eliza listened to it, feeling a kinship with the solitary creature, both of them on the edges of things, looking in at a world that had little place for them. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful navigation, of pretending not to notice the stares and whispers. Another day of her mother's increasingly desperate attempts at matchmaking and her father's silent worry. Another day of being Eliza Whitmore, the girl who had once been pretty and whole, who had once had prospects and dreams, who was now simply a problem to be solved. As sleep finally claimed her, she whispered a prayer to whoever might be listening, not for a husband, not for a miracle cure, but simply for the strength to face whatever came next with dignity. In a world that saw her as broken, she would have to find her own way to remain unbroken in spirit. The wind continued its mournful song through the night, carrying her prayers up to the star-filled sky, where they dispersed like smoke among the vast indifference of the universe. But sometimes, in the strange mathematics of fate, the universe was listening after all. The Saturday market in Cedar Ridge came alive with the rising sun, transforming the dusty main street into a river of commerce and gossip. Farmers brought their late harvest goods, miners' wives sold preserves and quilts, and traveling merchants displayed wares from distant cities. The air filled with a cacophony of haggling voices, creaking wagon wheels, and the occasional bray of a stubborn mule. Eliza moved through the crowd with practiced caution, her wicker basket balanced on her right arm, while her left hand occasionally brushed against the storefront walls for guidance. She had learned to navigate by sound and shadow, by the familiar rhythm of the town's weekly ritual. The blacksmith's wife always set up her stand of eggs and butter in the same spot. The Korean laundryman's distinctive accent called out from his usual corner. These were her landmarks in a world half-shrouded in darkness. She paused at Mrs. Garrett's vegetable stand, fingering the rough skin of the potatoes, when someone jostled her from behind. The impact sent her stumbling, her weak leg buckling. The basket flew from her arm, sending turnips rolling across the packed dirt street. "Watch yourself!" a man's voice barked. Though he had been the one to bump her, Eliza recognized him. Samuel Morrison, the Reverend's son. He looked down at her struggle to regain her balance, his lip curling slightly. "Oh, it's you, Miss Whitmore. Perhaps you should have someone accompany you if you can't manage the crowds." Heat flooded Eliza's cheeks as she bent awkwardly to gather her scattered vegetables. Her damaged vision made it difficult to spot them all, and her stiff leg protested the movement. She heard snickers from nearby, whispers that floated on the morning air like poisonous seeds. "That's the Whitmore girl, the one with the eye. Shame what happened. Who'd want damaged goods? Father's desperate to marry her off." A shadow fell across her, and she tensed, expecting more mockery. Instead, a large hand appeared in her limited field of vision, offering her a dirt-covered turnip. She looked up, squinting against the morning sun, and saw a figure she didn't recognize. A mountain of a man with a thick beard and weather-worn clothes that marked him as someone who lived beyond the town's boundaries. "Yours, I believe," he said simply. His voice was deep, roughened by wind and solitude, but not unkind. Eliza accepted the turnip, mumbling her thanks as she struggled to rise. Without asking, the stranger steadied her elbow, his touch surprisingly gentle for such large hands. Once she was stable, he stepped back, maintaining a respectful distance. "Caleb Jackson," he said by way of introduction, touching the brim of his worn hat. "Eliza Whitmore," she replied automatically, then immediately wished she hadn't. Now he would make the connection, see her more clearly, and the familiar dance of avoidance would begin. But Caleb Jackson merely nodded and moved away, heading toward the hardware store with the purposeful stride of a man with business to attend to. Eliza watched him go, noting the rifle slung across his back, the bearskin coat despite the mild weather, the way townspeople gave him a wide berth. A mountain man. Then, one of those solitary souls who came down from the high country only when necessity demanded. She finished her shopping with trembling hands, the encounter leaving her oddly unsettled. It wasn't until she was helping her mother put away the supplies that she heard more about the mysterious stranger. "That wild man was in town again," Margaret said, having gleaned fresh gossip from her morning visits. "Lives up on Eagle's Peak. They say hasn't been down in near 6 months." "Wild man?" Eliza kept her voice carefully neutral as she arranged preserves on the shelf. "Caleb Jackson. Came here about 3 years back. Bought old Murphy's claim up the mountain. Lives alone, trades furs and game for supplies. Mrs. Henderson says he had a wife once, died of the fever, made him strange. She says doesn't speak to hardly anyone." That evening, Eliza found herself thinking about the brief encounter. The man hadn't stared at her disabilities, hadn't shown the familiar mix of pity and revulsion she had grown accustomed to seeing. He had simply helped and moved on, as if her impediments were no more remarkable than the color of her dress. 3 days later, the talk of the town shifted to a new development. Thomas Whitmore had done something unprecedented. He had posted a notice at the general store, the saloon, and even the church. It was written in his blocky blacksmith's hand, the desperation evident in every carefully formed letter. Seeking husband for daughter, respectable young woman of good family, small dowry provided. Inquire at Whitmore Blacksmith. Eliza discovered the notices when she overheard 2 women discussing them at the milliner's shop. The blood drained from her face, and she had to grip the door frame to keep from swaying. "Did you see?" one woman tittered. "He's advertising her like livestock at auction." "Well, what else can the poor man do?" the other replied. "Though I notice he didn't mention her. Difficulties. Seems dishonest, if you ask me." Eliza fled before she could hear more. her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. She made it home on instinct alone, slamming the door behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. "Eliza!" Her mother emerged from the kitchen, flour dusting her apron. "What's wrong, dear?" "The notices," Eliza gasped out. "Father put up notices, like I'm a horse for sale." Margaret's face crumpled. "Oh, my dear, he's worried." "We both are. You have to understand." "I understand perfectly." Eliza's voice was bitter as winter wind. "I understand that I'm such an embarrassment, such a burden, that you're willing to advertise in public for anyone willing to take me off your hands." That night, dinner was a silent affair. Thomas wouldn't meet her eyes, and Margaret kept dabbing at her own with her napkin. Eliza ate mechanically, tasting nothing, feeling as if she were already a ghost in her own home. The next market day, she almost stayed home, but routine and necessity drove her out, armed with her basket and what remained of her dignity. The stares were worse now, the whispers louder. She was no longer just the poor Whitmore girl who'd been injured. She was the girl whose father was so desperate he'd publicly advertised for a husband. At the dry goods store, she heard the laughter before she rounded the corner. A group of young men lounged against the building, passing a flask between them despite the early hour. "Hey, boys," one called out. Jake Sullivan. She recognized his voice. "There's the bride for sale. What's the asking price? Miss Whitmore? Maybe we could pool our money." Another chimed in. "Wonder if her father offers a money-back guarantee. What if we get her home and find out she's more damaged than advertised?" Eliza kept walking, her knuckles white as she gripped her basket. Their laughter followed her like a pack of wolves. "Oh, come now, Miss Whitmore," Jake called after her. "Don't be unfriendly. We're potential customers. After all." She quickened her pace, but her unreliable leg chose that moment to falter. She stumbled, catching herself against a hitching post, and their laughter redoubled. "See that, boys? Can't even walk straight. Imagine trying to dance with her at the social." "That's enough." The voice cut through their merriment like an axe through wood. Caleb Jackson stood at the entrance to the alley, his massive frame blocking the light. He wasn't threatening, exactly. His hands hung loose at his sides, his expression calm. But something in his presence made the young men straighten up, their laughter dying in their throats. "Just having some fun, Jackson," Jake said, but his bravado had deflated. "Find your fun elsewhere." Caleb's tone brooked no argument. The group dispersed, muttering among themselves but unwilling to challenge the mountain man. Caleb watched them go, then turned to Eliza, who still clung to the hitching post. "You hurt?" he asked simply. "No," she managed. "Thank you, but I'm fine." He studied her for a moment, and she had the unsettling feeling he saw more than her damaged eye and twisted leg. Then he nodded and continued on his way, leaving her standing in the street with her heart pounding and her thoughts in turmoil. Word of the encounter spread quickly, as all things did in Cedar Ridge. By evening, when Caleb Jackson appeared at the Whitmore house, Eliza wasn't entirely surprised. She heard his distinctive knock firm but not aggressive, and her father's startled exclamation upon opening the door. "Mr. Jackson," Thomas said, his voice a mix of hope and confusion. "What can I do for you?" "Saw your notice." Caleb replied, "Thought we should talk." The blizzard descended upon Cedar Ridge like a biblical plague, turning the familiar landscape into an alien world of white fury. Ice crystals whipped through the streets with stinging force, and the temperature plummeted until even the hardiest souls huddled close to their fires. The mountains, usually visible in their majestic glory, disappeared behind a curtain of snow so thick it seemed the world ended at the edge of town. Caleb Jackson had taken shelter at Murphy's Tavern, the only establishment that stayed open regardless of weather. He sat in a corner, nursing a whiskey and listening to the conversations that swirled around him like the snow outside. The talk, as it often did these days, turned to the Whitmore family and their unusual situation. "Can't say I blame Tom Whitmore," one grizzled miner said, warming his hands on a tin mug. "Man's got to think practical out here. What's going to happen to that girl when he's gone? Still, another man countered. Advertising for a husband like she's a plot of land for sale? Ain't right. What ain't right is a young woman with no prospects. The first man shot back. At least he's trying to provide for her, more than some fathers would do. A younger man, already deep in his cups, laughed harshly. Provide for her? He's trying to pawn her off. Probably figured some desperate fool might take the bait if he threw in enough money. Watch your tongue, boy. An older woman who helped serve drinks warned. That's a good Christian family you're speaking of. Good Christian family with a daughter who's half blind and lame. The young man persisted. What kind of life is that for a man? Can't help with the harvest proper, can't see to mend clothes right, probably can't even— The scrape of a chair cut him off. Caleb had risen to his full height, and conversation in the tavern ceased. He didn't speak, didn't threaten. He simply stood there, looking at the young man with those dark, fathomless eyes that had seen things most townsfolk could only imagine. I was just saying, the man mumbled, suddenly finding his drink fascinating. You were just leaving, Caleb suggested quietly. The man left. Caleb settled back into his chair, but the damage was done. The cruel words hung in the air like smoke, and he found himself thinking of the young woman he'd encountered twice now. Both times, she'd carried herself with a dignity that seemed at odds with how the town treated her. There was steel in her spine, even if her body had been broken. He thought of his Sarah, dead these 4 years come spring. The fever had taken her quick, but those last days still haunted him. She'd made him promise not to become a ghost, not to let grief turn him into one of those hollow men who wandered the mountains more specter than human. He'd kept that promise. After a fashion, he'd survived. But living? That was something else entirely. The storm raged for 2 days, trapping everyone where they were. When it finally broke, the sun emerged to reveal a world transformed. Drifts reached halfway up doors, and the usual paths were obliterated. It would take days to dig out properly. Caleb made his way through the aftermath with the steady pace of someone accustomed to nature's extremes. His destination was the modest house on the edge of town where the Whitmores lived. He'd been thinking during those storm-locked days, turning things over in his mind like a prospector examining ore. He knocked on their door just as the sun reached its zenith, painting the snow-covered world in brilliant diamond sparkles. Thomas Whitmore answered, looking haggard. The storm had been hard on everyone, but worry had carved extra lines into his face. "Mr. Jackson," Thomas said, surprise evident. "I didn't expect— That is, please, come in." The house was warm but spare, everything neat despite showing signs of age and wear. Margaret Whitmore emerged from the kitchen, flour on her hands, and Caleb could smell bread baking. Eliza was nowhere to be seen. "Coffee?" Margaret offered, her voice carefully polite but wary. "Thank you, ma'am," Caleb replied, removing his snow-crusted hat. They sat at the worn kitchen table, 3 people circling around an uncomfortable topic like wolves around a campfire. Finally, Thomas cleared his throat. "You said before you saw my notice. I assume you've come to— inquire?" Caleb nodded slowly. "I have. But first, I think we should speak plainly. I know what this town says about your daughter. I've heard the whispers, the jokes. I also know that most of what they say comes from small minds and smaller hearts." Margaret's hands tightened on her coffee cup. "Mr. Jackson, you should know. Eliza's injuries are permanent. Her eye will never heal properly. And her leg— the doctors said the bones healed wrong. She'll always walk with difficulty. I'm not looking for perfection, Mrs. Whitmore," Caleb said quietly. "Had perfection once, lost it. What I'm looking for now is something different." "And what's that?" Thomas asked, leaning forward. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words. "Truth, I suppose. Strength that doesn't come from an unbroken body. Someone who understands that life can change in an instant. Leave you different than you were, but not necessarily less than you were." The kitchen door opened, and Eliza stood in the doorway. She'd clearly been listening, her face a mix of emotions Caleb couldn't entirely read. She moved into the room with her distinctive gait, chin raised despite the color in her cheeks. "Mr. Jackson," she said, her voice steady, "if you're here to discuss me like a piece of property, perhaps I should be present for the negotiations." "Eliza," her mother gasped. But Caleb held up a hand. "She's right," he said. "My apologies. Miss Whitmore, would you join us?" She sat carefully, her good eye fixed on him with an intensity that would have unnerved a lesser man. "Why?" she asked simply. "Why would you even consider this?" Caleb met her gaze directly. "Because I've been broken too. Because I know what it's like to have people look at you and see only what's missing, not what remains. Because I think you deserve better than cruel boys and whispered pity." "And what do you get out of it?" Eliza's voice was sharp, protective of herself in a way that spoke of too many disappointments. "Company," Caleb said honestly. "Someone to share the silence with who understands that sometimes silence is better than empty words. A partner, not a burden." Thomas started to speak, but Eliza cut him off. "And if I'm not what you expect, if the reality of living with someone who can't see properly, who can't walk without pain, becomes too much, then we'll face that truth when it comes." Caleb replied, "But I don't make promises lightly. Miss Whitmore, I've lived alone in those mountains for 4 years. I know loneliness, and I know hardship. I'm not a young man looking for an easy life. I'm a man who understands that the best things often come with sharp edges." The room fell silent except for the pop of wood in the stove and the distant sound of snow sliding off a roof. Eliza studied him, and he let her look, understanding her need to assess, to judge whether he was sincere or simply another form of cruelty dressed in kindness. "I won't be a charity case," she said finally. "If we do this, I won't have you looking at me with pity every day. I don't deal in pity," Caleb assured her. "Respect, yes. Honesty, certainly. But pity is for those who've given up. And you don't strike me as someone who's surrendered." Margaret was crying quietly, whether from relief or fear. Caleb couldn't tell. Thomas looked between his daughter and this strange mountain man, trying to reconcile his desperate hope with parental protection. "I'd need time," Eliza said, "to know you better, to understand what kind of life you're offering." "Fair enough," Caleb agreed. "I'll be staying in town until the pass is clear. Would you allow me to call on you, properly, with your parents' permission?" Eliza glanced at her parents, then back to Caleb. Something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or simply a recognition of kindred damage. "Yes," she said softly. "You may call." As Caleb prepared to leave, Thomas walked him to the door. "Mr. Jackson," he said quietly, "I need you to understand. She's my daughter, my only child. If you hurt her—" "Mr. Whitmore," Caleb interrupted gently. "I've had all the hurt one man can bear in a lifetime. I'm not looking to add to anyone's pain, least of all hers." Walking back through the snow-muffled streets, Caleb reflected on what had just transpired. He'd come to town for supplies and found himself offering for a bride, not out of pity or desperation, but from a recognition he hadn't expected. In Eliza Whitmore's determined eyes and stubborn chin, he'd seen something familiar, the refusal to let tragedy have the final word. Behind him, in the warm kitchen, Eliza sat with her parents in a different kind of silence. The dice had been thrown, the first steps taken toward a future none of them could fully envision. But for the first time in 3 years, there was something besides resignation in the air. It might have been hope, fragile as spring ice, but hope nonetheless. The first time Caleb returned, he brought honey, not store-bought honey in neat glass jars, but wild honey in a rough clay pot, wrapped in oilcloth and still bearing the faint scent of smoke from the calming of the bees. He stood at the Whitmore door in the early afternoon sun, his large frame casting a shadow across the threshold. "Found a hive in a hollow oak up the mountain," he explained simply when Eliza answered the door. "Thought your family might enjoy it." She accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly, not from her injuries, but from something else entirely. the unfamiliarity of being courted, if that's what this was. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson. Won't you come in?" They sat in the parlor, her mother hovering nearby with tea and anxious glances. Conversation came in fits and starts at first, like a creek finding its way over new stones. Caleb spoke of the mountains, describing the vista from his cabin in words that painted pictures for her limited vision. The eagles nest in the tall pines to the east. He told her, "Come dawn, you can watch them ride the thermals, circling higher until they're just specks against the sky. The valley below fills with mist most mornings, like a white sea with islands of treetops poking through." Eliza found herself leaning forward, caught by his descriptions. "I remember the eagles," she said softly. "Before the accident, I used to watch them for hours. They seemed so free. Still are," Caleb assured her. "Freedom doesn't go away just because we can't see it clear as we used to." It became a pattern. Twice a week, sometimes 3. Caleb would make the journey from wherever he was staying to call on her. He brought gifts that spoke of his mountain life: venison jerky smoked with juniper, pine cones as large as her fist, smooth stones from creek beds that felt like silk under her fingers. More than the gifts, though, he brought stories. He told her about tracking a wounded elk for 2 days through fresh snow, only to find it being tended by its herd, about the time he'd stumbled upon a bear's den and had to back away slowly, heart-hammering, while the bear decided whether he was worth the trouble, about the profound silence of a mountain winter night when the snow muffled everything and the stars seemed close enough to pluck. In return, Eliza found herself sharing her own stories. She spoke of her love for books, how she'd devoured every volume in Cedar Ridge's small library before the accident, how she'd once dreamed of being a teacher, of filling young minds with wonder at the written word. She even, haltingly, told him about the dark months after her injury, when she'd had to relearn everything from walking to pouring tea without spilling. "The worst part wasn't the pain," she admitted one afternoon as they walked slowly through her mother's garden, Caleb matching his pace to hers without seeming to notice. "It was everyone's assumption that my life was over, that I'd become half a person." "Are you?" Caleb asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than challenging. Eliza considered this, her fingers trailing over the rough bark of an apple tree. "Some days I feel like it, when I reach for something and misjudge the distance, or when my leg gives out at the worst moment. But other days," she paused, searching for words. "Other days I feel like I've become someone different, not less, just changed. Like iron in a forge," Caleb suggested. "Heated and hammered until it's a new shape, still iron but serving a different purpose." She looked up at him, squinting to bring his face into better focus. "Is that what happened to you when you lost your wife?" It was the first time either of them had directly mentioned his loss. Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully guarded memory. "Sarah was sunshine," he said simply. "Brought light to everything she touched. When the fever took her, it was like watching the sun go out for a long time after. I couldn't see any purpose in getting up, in going on. The mountains saved me. I think they don't care about your grief. They demand you survive. And in surviving, you remember how to live." They were sitting on the back porch now, the late afternoon sun slanting across the yard. Eliza could make out the golden light, the way it caught on Caleb's weathered hands as he carved a small piece of wood, a habit she'd noticed that occupied him during their conversations. "What are you making?" she asked. "A bluebird," he replied, holding it up so she could see the rough shape emerging. "Sarah loved them, said they brought good luck." "Do you believe that?" Caleb smiled, a rare expression that transformed his stern features. "I'm sitting here with you, aren't I?" The moment stretched between them, fragile and significant. Eliza felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of bonds she hadn't realized were there. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed. The town watched with the avid interest of people starved for drama. Some were skeptical. What could a mountain hermit want with a damaged girl except cheap labor?
Others were romantic, seeing it as a tale of two broken souls finding solace. Most were simply curious about how it would end. One day, Mrs. Henderson cornered Eliza at the general store. "My dear," she said with false sweetness, "I do hope you're being careful. Men like Mr. Jackson, living alone so long, they can be unpredictable. And in your condition, well, you're particularly vulnerable." Eliza straightened her spine. "Mr. Jackson has been nothing but respectful. Mrs. Henderson, more so than many men who've lived their whole lives in town." "I'm only thinking of your welfare." The older woman persisted. "What kind of life could he offer you, up in that wilderness? How would you manage with your difficulties?" "I appreciate your concern," Eliza said with icy politeness. "But I believe I'm capable of determining what I can and cannot manage." The confrontation left her shaking, but also oddly exhilarated. She'd defended Caleb, defended her right to make her own choices. It felt like a small victory. That evening, when Caleb called, she told him about the encounter. His jaw tightened, but he only said, "People fear what they don't understand. To them, choosing a hard life seems like madness." "Is it?" Eliza asked. "A hard life." Caleb set down the carving he'd been working on. The bluebird was nearly finished now. "It's honest," he said after a moment. "The mountain doesn't lie to you, doesn't pretend things are other than they are. It's hard, yes, but it's also beautiful. Clean. Real in a way town life never felt to me, even before Sarah." Eliza finished gently. He nodded. "I won't pretend it would be easy for you. The cabin is miles from anywhere. The winters are fierce, and come spring, the work never stops. But," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "but you wouldn't be alone. And you wouldn't be treated like something broken that needs hiding." They were dancing around the edges of something larger now, both of them aware of it. The unspoken question hung between them like morning mist. "Caleb," Eliza began, then stopped. "When you answered my father's notice, what did you really expect?" "Truth." He ran a hand through his beard, a gesture she'd come to recognize as uncertainty. "I expected to meet a woman beaten down by circumstance. Someone desperate enough to accept any offer, no matter how poor. Instead, I found you. And what did you find?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Someone who refuses to be pitied. Someone who's taken a bad hand and is still playing it with grace. Someone who makes me remember that strength isn't about what you can carry, but what you can endure." The words hung in the air between them. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. Her good eye and the damaged one alike. It had been so long since anyone had seen her as more than her limitations. "I need to ask you something," she said, gathering her courage. "And I need you to be honest, even if it hurts. Can you truly see a future with me? Not just any woman, but me specifically? With my eye that will never heal and my leg that will always slow me down." Caleb leaned forward, his dark eyes intent on hers. "Eliza, I see you clearer than you might think. Yes, I see your struggles, but I also see how you navigate them. I see the intelligence that compensates for limited vision, the determination that overcomes physical pain. I see a woman who could make a life in the mountains not in spite of her challenges, but because she's already learned the most important lesson the wilderness teaches." "What's that?" "That survival isn't about being unbreakable. It's about bending without breaking, adapting without surrendering. You've already proven you can do that." A week later, Thomas Whitmore asked the question that had been building like storm clouds. They were all gathered for Sunday dinner, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken tensions. "Mr. Jackson," Thomas began formally, setting down his fork. "You've been calling on my daughter for near a month now. I think it's time we spoke plainly about your intentions." Caleb met his gaze steadily. "My intentions are to offer your daughter marriage, if she'll have me, to provide for her, protect her, and respect her as my wife." Margaret gasped softly. Eliza's hand stilled on her napkin. "And if she says yes?" Thomas pressed. "What then? You'll take her to that cabin of yours, miles from any help if she needs it?" "Father," Eliza interjected, but Caleb raised a hand. "It's a fair question," he said. "Yes, I'd take her to the mountains, but not unprepared. I've already started making modifications to the cabin rails for support. Paths cleared and smoothed. I'm not asking her to live as I have, but to help me build something new, something that accommodates both of us." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Eliza, waiting. She could feel the weight of their expectations, her parents' desperate hope, Caleb's patient certainty, her own confused longings. "I need time to think," she said finally. It's not a decision to make lightly." "Of course," Caleb agreed, rising. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." As he left, touching her hand briefly in farewell, Eliza wondered at the turn her life had taken. A month ago, she'd been the town's object of pity, a burden to be disposed of. Now, she faced a choice that was truly hers to make. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was, she realized, the first real choice she'd had since the accident took so many others away. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with frost glittering on the window panes and the mountains standing witness in their autumn glory. It was a modest affair in the Whitmore parlor, with only immediate family and a handful of guests who had shown kindness rather than curiosity. Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony with obvious reluctance, his disapproval barely concealed behind ministerial duty. Eliza wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to accommodate her careful movements. The ivory silk had yellowed with age, but Margaret had adorned it with fresh lace at the cuffs and collar. As Thomas walked his daughter the few steps from the doorway to where Caleb waited, Eliza felt the weight of every gaze upon her. Some watched with genuine warmth, Mrs. Chen from the laundry, who had always treated her kindly, old Mr. Garrett, who remembered her as a bright-eyed child, Doc Hartley, who had tended her after the accident. But others observed with the avid interest of those attending a spectacle. She heard Martha Sullivan whisper to her companion, "Can barely walk down the aisle. How's she going to manage mountain life?" Caleb stood before the minister in his one good suit, his beard trimmed and hair combed back. When he took her hands in his, they were steady and warm, calloused from years of hard work but gentle in their grip. His eyes met hers with a certainty that helped quiet the doubts clamoring in her mind. "Do you, Caleb, take this woman?" Reverend Morrison's voice droned through the familiar words. But Eliza found herself focusing on smaller things, the way sunlight caught on Caleb's silver hair, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the faint scent of pine that clung to him even now. When it came time for her vows, her voice emerged stronger than she'd expected. "I do," she said, and meant it, despite everything. The kiss was brief, respectful, but in it she sensed a promise of patience and understanding that eased some of her apprehension. Then it was done. She was Eliza Jackson now, wife to a mountain man she'd known for barely a month, bound for a life she could scarcely imagine. The small reception that followed was awkward, with forced congratulations and stilted conversation. Jake Sullivan, pressed by his mother to attend, made a snide remark about mountain men collecting broken things, which earned him a look from Caleb that sent him scurrying to the other side of the room. "Just ignore them," her mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, my dear girl, I pray we've done right by you." "Don't cry, Mama," Eliza said softly. "This is my choice, the first real choice I've had in so long." When it came time to leave, the reality hit her with stunning force. Her few possessions were already loaded onto Caleb's wagon clothes, books, the quilt her grandmother had made, small treasures that comprised her world. Everything else would stay behind in this house where she'd grown up, learned to walk again, struggled to find her place in a world that no longer seemed to want her. Thomas embraced her at the door, his blacksmith's arm strong but trembling. "You send word if you need anything," he said gruffly. "Anything at all, you hear?" "I will, Papa. I've put aside some money." He continued quietly. "If things don't, if you need to come home." "Thomas," Margaret scolded through her tears. But Eliza understood. Her father was offering her an escape route. even now. "Thank you," she whispered, "but I don't think I'll need it." The wagon ride out of Cedar Ridge was torture and relief combined. Eliza sat beside her new husband on the hard bench, her body jarring with each rut and stone. Behind them, she heard the whispers following like dust in their wake. "Give it 6 months. Poor thing doesn't know what she's in for. Maybe the mountain air will do her good. More likely she'll be dead by spring." Caleb must have heard them too, but he kept his eyes on the road ahead, his hands steady on the reins. Only when they'd left the last buildings behind did he speak. "Are you comfortable? We can stop whenever you need." "I'm fine," Eliza lied, though her leg was already beginning to ache from the constant motion. "We'll make camp at Fuller's Creek tonight," he said. "It's only 6 miles, but no need to push harder the first day. Tomorrow we'll reach the cabin by late afternoon." The road, if it could be called that, wound upward through stands of aspen and pine. As they climbed, the air grew thinner and cleaner, sharp with the scent of evergreen and approaching snow. Eliza found herself straining to see the landscape through her limited vision, catching glimpses of golden leaves, dark tree trunks, and the endless sky above. They stopped twice to rest, Caleb helping her down from the wagon without comment on her difficulty. The second time, he produced a cushion from the supplies and placed it on the bench. "Sarah used to complain about the hard seat," he explained simply. "Kept this for, well, just kept it." Eliza settled back onto the cushion, touched by the gesture and what it represented. She was sitting where his first wife had sat, traveling the same road toward the same destination. The thought should have been uncomfortable, but instead she felt a strange kinship with the woman she'd never met. Fuller's Creek proved to be a small clearing beside a rushing stream, sheltered by massive pines. Caleb set up camp with practiced efficiency, while Eliza sat on a fallen log, feeling useless. She couldn't gather firewood with her unsteady gait, couldn't see well enough in the dimming light to help with cooking. When Caleb had a fire going and beans heating in a pot, she finally voiced her frustration. "I'm no help at all. You'd make better time alone." He looked up from stirring the pot. "Speed isn't the goal. Getting there safe is—" "But I can't do anything," she pressed. "I can't even—" "Can you tend the fire while I see to the horses?" he interrupted calmly. Yes, I suppose." "Can you slice this bread?" He handed her a loaf and a knife. "My hands are too cold to feel it proper." She took them, understanding what he was doing, but grateful nonetheless. As she worked, he continued setting up camp, creating a small, orderly space in the wilderness. When they ate their simple meal by firelight, Eliza was surprised to find herself hungry despite her nerves. "Tell me about the cabin," she said, needing to fill the silence with something besides her fears. "It's not large," Caleb warned. 2 rooms and a loft, but it's solid. I built it to last. There's a good spring nearby, never runs dry. Garden plot that Sarah started, though I haven't kept it up well. Root cellar for preserves. And the modifications you mentioned." A small smile crossed his face. "Rails along the porch and the path to the outhouse, smoothed out the floor where it was uneven, built a lower shelf in the kitchen so you won't have to reach so high. It's not perfect, but it's a start." The thoughtfulness of it made her throat tight. "You did all that before you even knew I'd say yes?" "Seemed foolish not to hope," he said simply. That night, they slept on opposite sides of the fire, wrapped in separate bedrolls. Caleb had offered his tent, but Eliza had declined, not ready for the intimacy of an enclosed space. She lay awake long into the night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness, the creek's constant murmur, the rustle of wind in pine needles, the distant howl that made her shiver. "Coyotes." Caleb's voice came quietly through the darkness. "They won't come near the fire." "How did you know I was awake?" "Your breathing. You'll learn to read the night sounds too, given time." "What if I can't?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "What if I can't adapt, can't learn, can't be what you need?" She heard him shift in his bedroll. "What I need is a partner, not a perfect mountain woman. We'll figure out the rest as we go." The next day dawned clear and cold. After a quick breakfast, they continued their climb. The road grew rougher, sometimes disappearing entirely into deer tracks and game trails. Caleb navigated with sure instinct while Eliza held tight to the wagon seat, her knuckles white with the effort of staying upright. By midday, they'd climbed above the aspens into pure evergreen forest. The air was thin enough that Eliza found herself breathing harder, her damaged body protesting the altitude. But there was something else, too. A lightness, an opening in her chest that had nothing to do with elevation. "Almost there," Caleb announced as they rounded a massive boulder. "Just past this ridge." Eliza strained to see, her good eye watering from wind and effort. Then the trees parted, and she caught her breath. The cabin sat in a small meadow, backed by towering peaks that scraped the sky. It was modest as Caleb had promised, built of solid logs with a stone chimney already sending up a welcoming spiral of smoke. He must have arranged for someone to prepare it. But it wasn't the building that struck her. It was the setting. Even with her limited vision, she could sense the vast space, the way the mountains cupped this small valley like protective hands. The late afternoon sun painted everything golden, and somewhere nearby she could hear water running. "Welcome home," Caleb said quietly. Home. The word sat strangely in her mind, but as he helped her down from the wagon and she stood on solid ground, breathing air that tasted of pine and possibility, she thought maybe, just maybe, it could be. Life in the mountains moved to rhythms Eliza had never known. Dawn came with the crow of Caleb's old rooster and the smell of wood smoke as he stoked the fire. She would lie in the small bed they now shared, still maintaining careful distance like polite strangers, and listen to him moving about the cabin, preparing for another day of survival. The first weeks were harder than she'd imagined. Every simple task became a challenge to navigate with her limited vision and unsteady gait. Drawing water from the spring meant a treacherous walk down a slope that seemed determined to catch her weak leg. Cooking over the wood stove required her to lean close to see, risking burns from the heat. Even something as basic as splitting kindling left her frustrated and exhausted. "I'm useless," she declared one morning after dropping the water bucket for the third time, soaking her skirts in the process. "You married a burden, not a helpmate." Caleb, who had been watching from the porch while pretending to mend a trap, came down to help her. "Takes time to learn new ways," he said, picking up the bucket. "Mountains aren't going anywhere." But Eliza heard the unspoken concerns. Winter was coming, and quickly. Already the aspens down the valley had shed their golden leaves, and morning frost lingered longer each day. There was wood to split and stack, meat to smoke, vegetables from the neglected garden to preserve, and she could barely manage to keep the fire going without his help. Gradually, though, she began to adapt. Her hands learned the feel of different tasks, compensating for what her eyes couldn't clearly see. She discovered that kneading bread was actually easier when she focused on touch rather than sight. Her good ear became attuned to the sounds that marked successful cooking, the gentle bubble of a proper simmer, the sizzle that warned of too much heat. Caleb proved endlessly patient, never criticizing her failures or showing frustration at her slow progress. He modified more things around the cabin notches carved into common tools so she could identify them by feel. A rope line strung between the cabin and the outhouse for winter storms, stones marking the edge of safe paths. One afternoon, as she struggled to patch a tear in his shirt, he sat beside her and showed her a different technique. "Sarah was near blind by lamplight," he explained quietly. "Taught me this way of stitching by feel. Here, close your eyes and try." It was one of the few times he'd mentioned his first wife beyond practical matters. Eliza found that closing her eyes did help. Her fingers could better sense the fabric's texture, the needle's path. When she finished the seam, running her fingers along it told her it was straight and strong. She must have been very capable, Eliza ventured carefully. "She was," Caleb agreed. "Different from you. Though Sarah was like a butterfly, bright and delicate. You're more like—" He paused, thinking. "Like the pines, bent by the wind maybe, but still standing." That night, the first real snow began to fall. They stood together on the porch,
watching the large flakes drift down like feathers. Eliza could make out their shapes against the dark sky, each one a small miracle of symmetry. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Wait until morning," Caleb promised. "When the sun hits fresh snow, the whole world turns to diamonds." But beauty came with danger. The next weeks brought storm after storm, each one sealing them more completely into their mountain sanctuary. The paths Eliza had finally learned disappeared under feet of snow. The simple trip to the woodpile became an expedition requiring careful planning. Then came the day when Caleb didn't return from his trap line on time. Eliza waited by the window, straining to see through the swirling white. 1 hour passed, then 2. By the 3rd, full dark had fallen, and terror gripped her heart. She knew the rules. Never go out in a storm. Never leave the cabin without clear landmarks. But she also knew that Caleb could be lying somewhere, injured and freezing. The thought of losing him, of being alone in this wilderness, drove her to action. Wrapping herself in every layer she could find, she ventured onto the porch. The wind immediately tried to tear her back inside, but she gripped the rail Caleb had installed and forced herself forward. She had watched him leave that morning, knew he headed north toward the ridge. If she could just... "Eliza!" His voice came from the white void, closer than she'd expected. "What are you doing out here?" Relief made her knees weak as his dark shape materialized from the storm. He was limping, one arm pressed against his side, but alive. "You're hurt," she said, moving to support him. "Bear trap snapped wrong," he grunted. "Caught my side. Nothing serious, but it slowed me down." Inside, with the door barred against the storm, she helped him out of his frozen outer clothes. The gash along his ribs was deep, but clean. As she cleaned and bandaged it, her hands steady despite her fear, she felt something shift between them. She had been the one to help this time, the one whose care mattered. "You shouldn't have come out," he said as she tied off the bandage. "You shouldn't have married someone too stubborn to follow good advice," she countered. He caught her hand as she moved to put away the medical supplies. "Eliza," he said, and something in his voice made her still. "I'm glad you're here, not just tonight, every night." The admission hung between them, fragile as the snowflakes melting on the windows. Slowly, carefully, she leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. His arm came around her, and for the first time since their wedding, they held each other not from duty, but from choice. Winter deepened its grip on the mountains. Some days the snow fell so thick they couldn't see past the porch. The firewood piles shrank steadily despite their careful rationing. Food stores that had seemed ample in autumn now looked frighteningly sparse. One particularly fierce night, wolves came down from the higher peaks. Eliza woke to their howling, closer than she'd ever heard before. Through the cabin's single window, she could make out dark shapes moving against the snow. "They're hungry," Caleb said, checking the rifle he kept loaded by the door. "Game scarce this year." The wolves circled for hours, their cries raising primitive fears Eliza hadn't known she possessed. When one grew bold enough to scratch at the door, Caleb fired a warning shot through the window. The pack retreated but didn't go far. "Will they come back?" Eliza asked. "Likely," Caleb admitted. "But the cabin's solid. We're safe inside." Safe, perhaps, but trapped. The next morning revealed tracks everywhere, around the cabin, the shed, even up to the chicken coop where their few remaining hens huddled. Going outside meant risk, but they needed water, firewood, to tend the animals. "I'll go," Caleb said. But Eliza saw how he favored his injured side, though he tried to hide it. "We'll go together," she decided. "You watch for wolves. I'll gather what we need." It became their pattern through the worst of the winter, working as a team, each compensating for the other's weaknesses. Eliza's sharp hearing often caught danger before Caleb's eyes could spot it. His strength made up for her limited mobility. Together, they managed what neither could have done alone. The deepest cold came in January, temperatures so low that trees split with sounds like gunshots. The spring froze solid, forcing them to melt snow for water. Even inside, ice formed on the walls farthest from the fire. One night, huddled together for warmth. Eliza felt Caleb shivering despite their shared blankets. His injury had healed poorly in the cold, leaving him more vulnerable than he'd admit. Without thinking, she pressed closer, offering her own body heat. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "For what?" "For staying, for not giving up, for being stronger than either of us knew you were." She thought of the woman who'd sat by her parents' window just months ago, convinced her life was over, that Eliza seemed like a stranger now. This mountain life had indeed broken her down, but like Caleb's iron in the forge metaphor, she was being reshaped into something new. "The cold won't last forever," she said softly. "No," he agreed. "Spring always comes, even after the hardest winter." They survived on bear meat Caleb had smoked in the fall, preserved vegetables from the root cellar, and careful portions of flour and beans. Eliza learned to make soup from bones and pine needles, to brew tea from dried herbs that helped ease their hunger. She became expert at mending clothes so patched they barely resembled their original forms, at making candles from every scrap of fat they could spare. When the wolves returned, bolder with desperation, she stood beside Caleb at the window with the old shotgun, ready to defend their home. When his fever came, inevitable in the cold with his weakened condition, she nursed him through it with herbs and sheer determination, keeping the fire burning through 3 days and nights without sleep, and slowly, impossibly, the days began to lengthen. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The ice on the walls started to melt, drop by precious drop. One morning, Eliza woke to a sound she'd almost forgotten. Birdsong. A mountain bluebird perched on the porch rail, its breast brilliant against the lingering snow. She watched it through the window, tears streaming down her face at this small promise that winter was loosening its grip. "Spring's coming," she told Caleb, who was finally strong enough to sit up and take proper meals. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "We made it through. Together," she added, and the word held all the weight of their shared survival, their growing bond, their hard-won understanding that strength came in many forms. Outside, the bluebird sang again, and Eliza remembered the carving Caleb had made during their courtship, a symbol of good luck. He'd said, looking at her husband, for he was truly that now, in every way that mattered. She thought perhaps some symbols carried truth after all. The spring sun transformed Cedar Ridge into a muddy mess of melting snow and swollen streams. After 6 months in the mountains, the town seemed impossibly loud and crowded to Eliza as their wagon rolled down the familiar main street. She sat straighter beside Caleb, aware of the stairs following their progress but no longer shrinking from them. They needed supplies: flour, salt, ammunition, seeds for the expanded garden Eliza planned. The winter had depleted their stores, but they'd survived, and now it was time to prepare for the seasons ahead. Caleb had suggested she might want to stay with her parents while he conducted business, but Eliza had refused. "We're partners," she'd said firmly. "Where you go, I go." The first test came at Henderson's general store. Mrs. Henderson nearly dropped her measuring scoop when they entered together. "Eliza Whitmore," she exclaimed, then caught herself. "I mean, Mrs. Jackson, my word, we thought, that is, we hadn't heard." "We wintered well, thank you," Eliza replied calmly, moving through the store with new confidence. Her gait was still uneven, her vision still limited, but she navigated with the assured movements of someone who'd learned to trust herself. Other customers pretended to shop while watching them openly. Eliza heard the whispers starting, not the cruel mockery of before, but something tinged with surprise and perhaps reluctant respect. "Look at her, she's positively glowing. Must be hardy stock after all. Jackson seems content enough. Who would have thought?" At the fabric counter, she selected sturdy cotton for new clothes, her fingers testing the weave. Mrs. Chen from the laundry appeared at her elbow, smiling warmly. "Mrs. Jackson, how wonderful to see you looking so well. The mountain air agrees with you. Thank you, Mrs. Chen. The mountains have taught me a great deal. I can see that, the older woman said, studying her with kind eyes. You carry yourself differently now, like someone who knows her own strength. While Caleb loaded supplies, Eliza visited her parents. Her mother answered the door and promptly burst into tears. Oh, my dear girl, let me look at you. Margaret's hands fluttered over her daughter's face, taking in the sun-touched skin, the calluses from hard work, the steady way she stood despite her disabilities. You look wonderful. Thomas emerged from his workshop, wiping his hands on his leather apron. His eyes widened at the sight of her. Healthy, confident. No longer the broken bird he'd been so desperate to see settled. Eliza, he said gruffly, emotion thick in his voice. You're well? Very well. Papa, the winter was hard, but we managed. Caleb takes good care of me, and I take care of him too. Over tea, she told them about their mountain life, carefully editing out the worst of the dangers. She spoke of learning to preserve meat, of successfully treating Caleb's fever, of the garden she planned to plant. Her parents exchanged glances, seeing their daughter transformed. And you're happy? Margaret asked tentatively. Eliza considered the question. Happy seemed too simple a word for what she'd found in the mountains. She'd discovered strength she didn't know she possessed, a partnership built on mutual respect, a love that had grown slowly but deep as tree roots. Yes, Mama, happier than I ever thought possible. Their shopping complete. They prepared to leave town, but as they passed the saloon, a group of men spilled out, including Jake Sullivan and his cronies. Jake's eyes lit with malicious recognition. Well, if it isn't the mountain man and his broken bride, he called out, speech slightly slurred from day drinking. Surprised to see you both still breathing, taking bets you wouldn't last the winter. His friends laughed, but it was uneasy. Something in Caleb's stance, in Eliza's steady gaze, made them uncomfortable. Seems you lost that bet, Caleb said mildly, but his hand rested on the rifle mounted beside the wagon seat. Jake stepped closer, focusing on Eliza with a sneer. Still playing house, sweetheart? Or has he figured out what a bad bargain he made? The only bad bargain, Eliza said clearly, would have been ending up with a man like you, weak, cruel, and drowning his inadequacies in whiskey before noon. The words rang out in the suddenly quiet street. Jake's face flushed dark red. He lunged forward, whether to grab her or strike her unclear. But Caleb moved faster. One moment Jake was reaching up toward the wagon. The next, he was flat on his back in the mud, Caleb's boot on his chest. Touch my wife, Caleb said quietly, and you'll learn what a bad bargain really looks like. You can't. She's just a cripple. Jake wheezed. She's worth 10 of you on her worst day, Caleb replied. And she's the reason I'm letting you up instead of breaking your worthless neck. Eliza believes in mercy. Me, I'm still deciding. He stepped back, allowing Jake to scramble to his feet. The younger man's friends pulled him away, muttering about crazy mountain folk. But Eliza noticed how other townspeople looked at them now, not with pity or mockery, but something approaching respect. As they drove out of town, Eliza slipped her hand into Caleb's. Thank you, she said softly. For what? For defending me, for seeing me as worth defending. He squeezed her fingers gently. You defended yourself just fine. I just emphasized the point. A week later, unexpected visitors arrived at their mountain cabin. Eliza was working in the garden, coaxing life from soil that had lain fallow too long. When she heard horses approaching, her improved hearing caught them long before they came into view. Caleb, she called. Someone's coming. He emerged from the woodshed, axe in hand, watchful but not alarmed. 3 riders appeared through the trees, well-dressed men who looked out of place in the wilderness. The lead rider, a portly man with shrewd eyes, introduced himself as Wallace Hartman, representing the Mountain Pacific Railroad Company. His companions were surveyors, studying the landscape with professional interest. Mr. Jackson, Hartman began after refusing their offer of coffee. "I'll be direct. The railroad is planning a route through this valley. Your land sits right where we need to lay track. We're prepared to make you a generous offer." Caleb's face remained impassive. "Not interested in selling." "Perhaps you should hear the offer first. $500, more than enough to buy land elsewhere and build a fine new cabin." "No." Hartman's smile tightened. "Mr. Jackson, progress is coming whether you like it or not. Wouldn't it be better to profit from it?" "This is our home," Eliza interjected, moving to stand beside her husband. "We've paid for it in ways you can't understand. It's not for sale at any price." The businessman looked at her dismissively, taking in her obvious disabilities. "Ma'am, with respect, perhaps your husband should handle—" "My wife speaks for both of us," Caleb cut in. "The answer is no." Hartman's demeanor shifted, becoming harder. "The railroad has ways of acquiring necessary land, Mr. Jackson. Legal ways. Wouldn't it be simpler to take our generous offer now?" "Are you threatening us?" Eliza asked. "Merely explaining realities. Ma'am, a crippled woman and a hermit against the march of progress, those aren't favorable odds." The temperature seemed to drop despite the spring warmth. Caleb stepped forward, and the surveyors nervously adjusted their positions. "Get off our land," he said quietly. "Now." Hartman gathered his dignity. "You'll be hearing from our lawyers. Mr. Jackson, this isn't over." After they left, Eliza found herself trembling, not with fear, but anger. "They can't just take our home, can they?" Caleb's jaw was set grimly. "They'll try. Men like that. They're used to getting what they want, but this land is legally ours, bought and paid for. We'll fight if we have to." Over the following weeks, they prepared. Caleb rode to the county seat to verify their land deed was properly filed. Eliza wrote letters to what authorities she could think of, her neat script explaining their situation. They improved their defenses, not against wolves this time, but against a different kind of predator. The harassment started small. Surveyors accidentally crossing onto their land. Official-looking letters questioning the validity of their claim. Someone poisoned the stream above their spring, though thankfully Eliza's sharp nose caught the contamination before they drank. Then came the night riders. Eliza woke to the sound of horses and rough voices. Through the window, she could see torches moving through the darkness. "Jackson," a voice called out. "You've got one last chance. Take the money and leave, or things get unpleasant." Caleb was already up, rifle in hand. "Stay down," he told Eliza, but she was reaching for the shotgun. "We're in this together," she reminded him. The riders circled the cabin, whooping and hollering, trying to intimidate. One threw a torch at the woodpile, but the spring dampness kept it from catching. Another fired shots into the air. Caleb returned fire, his shot precisely placed to knock the hat off the lead rider. "Next one goes through something more vital," he called out. "This is private property. Leave now or face the consequences." The riders milled uncertainly. They'd expected fear, capitulation. Instead, they faced a man who knew these mountains better than they ever could, and a woman who'd survived worse than their threats. "This ain't over," the leader shouted. But they retreated into the night. The next morning, they found a notice nailed to a tree, an official summons to appear before a judge regarding disputed land claims. The railroad was making its legal move. "We need help," Eliza said, studying the document. "Someone who understands law better than we do." Help came from an unexpected source. 2 days later, Doc Hartley arrived on horseback, accompanied by a younger man in a city suit. "Eliza, Caleb." The doctor greeted them warmly. "Heard you were having some trouble. This is my nephew, Robert Hartley. He's a lawyer in Denver, specializing in land rights." Robert Hartley was nothing like his uncle, thin where the doctor was robust, nervous where the older man was confident. But when he spoke about law, his stutter disappeared and his eyes sharpened with intelligence. "The railroad is claiming prior surveying rights," he explained after reviewing their papers. "It's a weak argument, but they're counting on you not having the resources to fight it. However, With your original deed and evidence of improvements to the land, we can make a strong case." "What'll it cost?" Caleb asked bluntly. Robert smiled shyly. "Uncle Doc saved my life when I was young. Consider this repayment. Besides, I don't much like bullies, whether they wear gang colors or business suits." The legal battle began. Robert proved as fierce in a courtroom as Caleb was in the wilderness. He found precedents, filed motions, and slowly built a wall of law around their claim. The railroad pushed back, but each attack was met and turned aside. During this time, unexpected support came from Cedar Ridge. Mrs. Chen organized a group of women to send supplies. Old Mr. Garrett testified about Caleb's legal purchase of the land. Even some who'd mocked Eliza before now stood with them against the outside threat. Funny how facing a common enemy changes perspectives, Margaret Whitmore said during one of their visits to town. "People are saying if you two can stand up to the railroad, maybe we all can stand up for what's right." The final hearing came in late spring. Eliza dressed in her best clothes. Caleb wore his wedding suit. They sat in the small courthouse, surrounded by railroad lawyers and their expensive arguments. But they had something more powerful: the truth, the law, and a young lawyer who believed in justice. Robert systematically destroyed each railroad claim, showing their threats and harassment, proving the validity of the Jackson claim. When the judge ruled in their favor, Eliza felt Caleb's hand find hers. They'd won. Their home was safe. Outside the courthouse, Hartman approached them one last time. "You've won this round," he said bitterly. "But progress doesn't stop. The railroad will find another route, and your little valley will be left behind, forgotten." "Good," Eliza replied. "We like it forgotten. That's rather the point." As they rode home, the mountains seemed to welcome them back. Their cabin sat unchanged in its meadow, smoke rising peacefully from the chimney. But they were changed. They'd faced down threats together, stood their ground, proved that neither disability nor isolation made them weak. "Thank you," Caleb said as they dismounted. "For what?" "For being my partner. For having the courage to fight. For showing me that protecting something you love is worth any risk." Eliza smiled, looking out over their valley, their home, fought for and won. "We're quite a pair, aren't we? The mountain hermit and the broken bride who refused to break." "Not broken," Caleb corrected, pulling her close. "Never broken? Bent, maybe. Scarred, certainly. But stronger at the mended places." As spring afternoon light flooded their valley, Eliza knew he was right. They'd been tested by winter, by prejudice, by greed, and they'd emerged victorious. Whatever came next, they would face it as they'd learned to face everything together, each lending strength where the other needed it, building a life that others might not understand but that fit them perfectly. The bluebirds were nesting in the meadow now, their songs filling the air with promise, and in the small cabin beneath the towering peaks, two souls who'd thought themselves too damaged for love continued proving that sometimes the best things come from the hardest journeys. The summer sun painted the mountain meadow in shades of gold and green, wildflowers swaying in the warm breeze like nature's own celebration. Eliza sat on the porch Caleb had expanded that spring, her hands resting on the gentle swell of her belly. The discovery of her pregnancy had come as a surprise to them both. After the harsh winter and the stress of the railroad fight, she hadn't noticed the early signs. "A baby," she murmured for the 100th time, still marveling at the life growing within her. Her damaged body, which the world had deemed broken beyond use, was creating new life. Caleb emerged from the cabin with 2 cups of pine needle tea, moving with the careful attention he'd shown since learning of her condition. The tough mountain man who'd faced down wolves and railroad barons now fretted over her every movement. "You should rest," he said, though she'd been sitting for the past hour. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she reminded him gently. Mountain women have been having babies since these peaks were formed. But she understood his concern. The nearest doctor was a day's ride away, and her physical challenges added risks they couldn't ignore. They'd already made plans. When her time grew near, They'd stay in town with her parents until the baby came. "Have you thought of names?" she asked, accepting the tea gratefully. Caleb settled beside her, his large hand coming to rest on her stomach with infinite tenderness. "If it's a boy, maybe Thomas, after your father. He's a good man. And if it's a girl?" He was quiet for a moment. "Sarah used to talk about naming a daughter Hope, said it was the most important thing to carry forward." Eliza covered his hand with hers. "Hope is a beautiful name." They sat in companionable silence, watching the eagles circle overhead. The garden she'd planted was thriving, rows of vegetables promising good harvest. The additions to the cabin, a larger room for the baby, better insulation for winter, were nearly complete. They were building a future neither had dared imagine just a year ago. As autumn approached and Eliza's time drew near, they made the journey to Cedar Ridge. The town's reaction to her visible pregnancy was everything from shocked whispers to genuine congratulations. "Mrs." Chen pressed herbs into her hands with detailed instructions for easing labor. Even Mrs. Henderson, that perpetual gossip, seemed subdued by the evidence of their thriving marriage. They stayed with the Whitmores, Margaret fussing over her daughter while Thomas and Caleb spent long hours discussing expansions to the mountain cabin. The two men had developed a deep mutual respect, bonded by their love for Eliza. "Never thought I'd be a grandfather," Thomas admitted one evening. "Gave up hope of that when—" He gestured vaguely at Eliza's disabilities. "Life has a way of surprising us." Caleb replied, "Your daughter taught me that." The first snow was falling when Eliza's labor began. Doc Hartley was summoned, arriving with his usual calm efficiency. The labor was long and difficult, her damaged body struggling with the demands of childbirth. There were moments when fear gripped everyone present, when her strength seemed to fail, when the baby seemed stuck. But Eliza had learned endurance in the mountains. She'd survived blizzards and wolves, threats and hardships. She drew on that deep well of strength now, gripping Caleb's hand as he whispered encouragement. "You're the strongest person I know," he told her during a brief respite between pains. "You can do this." And she did. As dawn broke over Cedar Ridge, a healthy baby girl announced her arrival with lusty cries. Doc Hartley placed the infant in Eliza's arms, and she stared down at the tiny face with wonder. "Hope," she whispered. "Hello, Hope." Caleb's face was wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. "She's perfect," he said, touching his daughter's tiny fist with one trembling finger. "Of course she is," Margaret said through her own tears. "She's got mountain stock in her." They stayed in town through the worst of winter, letting Eliza recover and Hope grow strong. The baby thrived, seemingly inheriting her parents' resilience along with her mother's dark hair and her father's serious eyes. Spring's return brought them home to the mountains. Hope traveled swaddled against Eliza's chest, sleeping peacefully despite the wagon's jolts. The cabin welcomed them back. Smoke already rising from the chimney, neighbors from the valley below had prepared it for their return. Life with an infant brought new challenges. Night feedings when Eliza could barely see in the darkness, washing endless cloths with water that had to be hauled from the spring, keeping the cabin warm enough for a baby while conserving precious firewood. But there was joy, too. Hope's first smile, breaking across her face like sunrise. The way she gripped Caleb's finger with surprising strength. Her fascination with the play of light through the windows. Something Eliza could share despite her limited vision. "She's teaching me to see differently," Eliza told Caleb one evening as Hope reached for the dancing shadows on the wall. "Through her eyes, everything is new and wonderful." Summer brought unexpected visitors. A small wagon train, lost and struggling, found their way to the cabin. Among them was a young couple with a daughter who walked with crutches, her legs twisted from a childhood illness. The girl, Anna, watched Eliza with wide eyes as she moved efficiently around the cabin despite her limp and limited vision. "Ma'am," she finally asked, "how do you do everything? My ma says I'll never be able to keep house proper." Eliza knelt carefully beside the girl, balancing Hope on her hip. "Your ma is wrong," she said gently. You'll learn to do things your own way. Different doesn't mean less capable. She spent the afternoon showing Anna tricks she'd learned, how to balance differently, how to use sound and touch to supplement sight, how to modify tasks to suit her abilities. When the wagon train departed the next day, Anna hugged her fiercely. "Thank you for showing me I don't have to be afraid," the girl whispered, watching them go. Caleb put his arm around Eliza. "You gave her hope. Someone gave it to me first," Eliza replied, thinking of that long-ago day when a mountain man refused to see her as broken. As Hope grew from infant to toddler, she showed no fear of her mother's differences. She learned early to call out her location, to bring things to Eliza rather than expecting her to see them. She rode on Caleb's shoulders through the forest, chattering about everything she saw, painting word pictures that helped Eliza see through her daughter's eyes. One autumn evening, as they sat by the fire with Hope playing at their feet, Eliza reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The frightened, bitter girl who'd sat by her parents' window seemed like a stranger now. That girl could never have imagined this life, hard but fulfilling, challenging but rich with love. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, noticing her distant expression. "About that notice my father posted," she said. "Seeking husband for daughter. Such a desperate thing. Yet it brought us together." "Maybe it wasn't desperate," Caleb suggested. "Maybe it was hopeful. Maybe he knew you needed something more than Cedar Ridge could offer. A mountain man who saw past the surface? A woman strong enough to match the mountains." Hope toddled over, offering them a pine cone she'd been examining. "Pretty," she announced solemnly. "Yes," Eliza agreed, pulling her daughter close. "Very pretty." Through the window, the peaks glowed with alpenglow, that magical light that turned stone to gold. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled. Not a threat now, just part of the wild symphony they'd learned to live within. The girl everyone had refused to marry sat surrounded by love, her home defended and won, her future bright with possibility. The blind and disabled bride had become a mountain wife, mother and partner, not despite her challenges, but because she'd learned to see them as part of her strength. "Everyone refused," she said softly, remembering all those who'd turned away. "Except you," Caleb smiled, that rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "Their loss," he said simply. "My gain, our miracle." As night settled over their valley, the little family drew close around the fire. Hope fell asleep in her mother's arms, safe and loved. The cabin that had once housed grief now sheltered joy, and in the vast wilderness of the Colorado mountains, two souls who'd thought themselves too damaged for love continued to prove that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the harshest ground. The seasons would turn, bringing new challenges and new blessings. Hope would grow strong and free in these mountains, learning from parents who knew that true strength came not from perfection, but from perseverance. And their story would be whispered in the valleys and towns, a reminder that love sees with different eyes than the world. In the end, it hadn't mattered that everyone refused the blind and disabled bride. It had only mattered that one man, scarred by his own losses, had seen her true worth. Together, they'd built something unbreakable, a love as enduring as the mountains themselves, and twice as beautiful for being unexpected. Thank you for listening to this tale from the Wild West. Where are you enjoying this story from? Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles. Just like the old telegraph lines that once connected frontier towns. If you enjoyed this story of love conquering all odds in the Colorado mountains, please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales of courage, romance, and adventure from America's frontier. Share your thoughts about Eliza and Caleb's journey. Did their love story touch your heart as much as it touched mine? Until we meet again around the campfire, partners.